Good evening and welcome to Widge's webinar with our guest, Lorraine Candy, who I'm really looking forward to talking to about not getting stuck in your career ever, whatever your age. She's the queen of reinvention. She's had 3 distinct incarnations, always using her skills as a journalist to adapt, grow and seize opportunities. So starting at the beginning, Lorraine started off on a local paper in Cornwall. She moved as a news journalist to the Daily Mirror, the Times, and the much lamented Today newspaper. She then transitioned to glossy fashion magazines, where she combined her strong news sense and a hunger for an exclusive with an eye for style and the patience to sit through a lot of catwalk shows. She edited Cosmopolitan, Elle and Sunday Times Style, and has been a newspaper columnist for the Times and the Daily Mail. Then she left and became her own boss. She's currently rising high with her podcast and brand, Postcards from Midlife, where she and co-host Trish Halpin interview celebrities, writers and experts on navigating career and life as you get older. They have over 1 million downloads, hosted their first sellout 2-day event. And on top of that, she's written 2 best-selling books on parenting teenage girls and going through the menopause and midlife. And she's become a spokesperson for both. She still writes a lot for newspapers and magazines, and I feel she's probably got yet another new trick up her sleeve. We met and worked together on magazines back in the day at a time when we were all transitioning from good old print to digital platforms and understanding and unleashing the power of social media. Lorraine has always loved being an early adopter. She's very competitive, I think it's fair to say. But let's start at the beginning. If you've got any questions, which we'd love to hear, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll ask them later. So, Lorraine, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. That was a lovely intro. Thank you, Louise.
It's a pleasure. So you started work at 16 on a local paper. You didn't go to uni. Do you think it's possible for young women today to achieve that whole amazing CV that you have without a degree? Because what difference did not going to uni make to you? Did you feel you had to work harder to prove yourself?
I think for me, so we're talking, I'm 55 this week, so I started at 16, so, a long time ago when there were a lot more opportunities, actual jobs in print journalism. And I had local newspapers. So in Cornwall, there were 4 or 5 local newspapers. Well, that's not the case today. So if you want to work in print journalism, that's going to be slightly more difficult. I think it's very difficult to get into journalism now if you haven't gone to university. I think there is an issue around social class, which is a real problem. I think there was a NCTJ survey, wasn't there, where they've been monitoring diversity, and the majority of journalists have gone through university, and the majority get to university if they're in a wealthier, better schooling. So it's a little bit unfair, to be honest. Even now, I do think it would be quite difficult, therefore, to make it into newspaper journalism, which is the area I know about or have worked in predominantly as a journalist now, as a young journalist. I do think women's magazines, perhaps, and maybe websites is a little bit easier. It's to get in. There are more spaces. There's different kind of things to do. And I think the idea of journalism today, and I've done so many podcasts recently and interviews on TV and worked with much, much younger journalists, much younger women. And what they have to be is a master of a lot of things. So they have to be able to podcast. They have to interview on audio. They have to be able to do interview on video. They have to be able to write. They have to have something else going on at the same time. And I'm watching these younger women who are really brilliant at doing all of those things, forming their kind of mini brands around them while still being great journalists. So I think that's the new way in, rather than going in as we did, just with one thing clear in mind. We were going to be print journalists, see our bylines in newspapers. I think there's a wider way of getting in, and we need to utilize that more.
So did you ever have imposter syndrome? I mean, working at the Times, you've got loads of Oxbridge graduates there, a lot of maybe male Oxbridge graduates. Did you ever feel, or did you just not care?
So I was a features editor at the time. So I was one of the youngest features editor across the whole newspaper. And I worked with some great female journalists above me, actually, on the launch of Times 2. I was deputy editor on the launch of the Times Saturday magazine when it first came out, because it wasn't a glossy, it's part of the print product. I worked with Jill Morgan, amazing journalist. So I learned a lot from the women above me. They were incredibly supportive and always have been throughout my career. But I have a real issue with the word imposter syndrome. I think we use this language around ourselves. You say imposter, you think woman. We're never not, we have every right to be there as anyone else in the room. So I never consider myself an imposter in any room. If that's my training, if I'm able to do it, if my skill set is there, then I'm not an imposter. I might be an imposter in a brain surgery operation because I don't know anything about that. But in journalism, why would I ever be? I've got the experience. Why would women ever be imposters? I don't like to use the word, but certainly I would be, as features editor on the Times, so I would be deciding what was going in and what the bigger picture stuff was that we were doing, cover of Times 2. I would be in news conference with all Oxbridge graduates. And then this is what I'm saying about the social class elements of what we still face in journalism today. But I don't think that made me less intelligent. I don't think it gave me less status. Peter Stoddard was my editor. I found him very receptive to working with women, really empowering and really great at making sure women got their chances. So, maybe I was lucky with that editor. I was really lucky with Richard Stott at the Daily Mirror. He really opened up doors for women. He was incredibly supportive. I had some really great male editors, but I never saw that as an imposter. Being a journalist is about being curious, making sure your facts are absolutely correct, and having great ideas. And I think that, as long as you're doing that, then you're delivering.
So when you started out, what was your dream job? Or your dream, your
I
ambition
wanted to
at the
edit
time?
Cosmopolitan. I think when I started out, I just could see the history. I was a magazine obsessive. I used to go to the library on a Saturday and read all their copies that they would have there, and just the crafting. I was very interested in the visual side of something and the crafting of it and the power of Cosmo. It brought a different message to the world. And I loved Just 17, Smash Hits, all of those magazines. They were really important culturally to someone growing up in Cornwall, in a very rural area on the edge of a moor, where you didn't really get to see much of the cultural side of the world. It was difficult to get anywhere without a car or someone driving you there, taking you there. So for me, Cosmo was the kind of, was the goal. But I wanted to write, and I wanted to be a journalist. And I think I knew I had to be a journalist properly, because I didn't want to go in via fashion.
But which is interesting, when you have worked on a number of more fashiony magazines, haven't you, than Cosmopolitan, like Elle?
Yeah, I mean, the whole business model for Elle was an advertising revenue model. So it was a fashion advertising, fashion and beauty advertising revenue model. So from that point of view, I have always loved fashion, but I was always more interested in the story behind things. And I always thought that if you can be a journalist, it gets you into any room you want to be in, really. I mean, you can go anywhere, you can ask to be anywhere, you have a great idea, you can get to those places as a journalist. And I didn't think I could do that as a fashion, via the fashion route. For me, it was more important to be the writer in the room, but able to really appreciate and love the fashion, because I do really love fashion. That, I couldn't have stayed on Elle for 12 years if I hadn't loved fashion.
I mean, you say that you had really supportive editors, but we just carried out surveys showing less female bylines than men. Is there a difference to how women are treated in newsrooms, which often do have more men in than women, compared to magazines and digital platforms, which may have more women?
Well, my last experience of that was at the Sunday Times, so nearly 4 years ago. And I would say the digital platforms were almost entirely male. In fact, when I joined, they were all male. There were no women there at all. So I think that, but I'm talking about a weekly newspaper, print newspaper. I think tech is notoriously a bro culture. So I think actually it's the same in both places. I think, well, we know that patriarchy doesn't really serve anybody. It doesn't serve men. It doesn't serve women particularly well. It's a broken system. So I think it's, you have to work at what's the best way of making it work for you, and find people that are going to support and empower you, and have your boundaries around how you're spoken to, what language is used around you, what language you see appearing in print, you know, that you can do that in your own way. You can nudge around headlines. And, you know, I come from an era when victims of crime were described by their hair color. So I feel like we have come a long way, female victims of crime. So I think we've come a long way. I don't think it's ideal. I still think it's quite a boisterous environment, the newsroom, but that's, you know, the energy of news is brilliant. But I know many brilliant women at higher levels, senior levels in newspapers. I think there's still an issue. That NCTJ survey last year did say that it's the senior level that we still have the gender gap, but the women are coming through. So I'm hoping, I'm always positive about these things. I'm hoping it will get better.
I mean, you talked earlier about journalism and wanting to work in Cosmo, which an iconic magazine that has campaigned for social change in countries all over the world. But do you think there's still a snobbery for male and female journalists about the quality and the kind of journalism in magazines? Oh, well, that's women's magazines, yet you can create a story or a campaign that gets picked up and run across, you know, TV, radio, news, and print and other digital platforms.
Well, I think we've discovered in the last few years with social media that the way you deliver the message is really, really important. So you can deliver many campaigning messages in around women's health, for example, on a newspaper, but it's always delivered in a really inaccessible, not very friendly, not very community-based way. So it doesn't hit, it doesn't land. But you can deliver a message via a women's magazine in the language that everyone understands and reach the people you really need to reach to make change happen. You can activate a community, which is what social media does. It activates a community. I don't think newspapers have that same thing around them, around the kind of issues that I wanted to activate community. I think they do around big news stories and big change, but perhaps they don't around, well, as we found, around stories around the menopause and HRT, and stories around domestic violence, you know, women's sexual health and health generally, and the way women are treated generally in society. I don't think newspapers work as well sometimes. So they do have an attitude in a way that the community you build around a magazine is somehow lesser than. It's not as smart, it's not as intelligent, because that community is as interested in skincare as it is in women's rights with regards to domestic violence. So that's wrong. I mean, that's just simply wrong. I mean, one of the big things we did at Cosmo when I was there, so you bear in mind I was there over 25 years ago, was campaign around Rohypnol and date rape, because we were getting so many letters from women saying, I'm going out and I'm coming back and things are happening to me and I can't remember it. And when you get a volume of letters from your readers, they're not going to write to a newspaper. They're going to write to a trusted brand that seems to have their interests at heart, that cares for them. And we had the Home Secretary at the time, David Blunkett, come in to talk to. I mean, I said, you have to come in. I'm getting volumes and volumes of letters. Something's happening to women. We need to change it. We need a helpline for women to call. So, it was a very powerful place. But I was still commissioning stories about dating and, single women looking for male partners. So, it's possible to do. It's possible for women to do all things and be all things and be interested in all things. So I think that has changed. So I think, magazines have had a really great campaigning voice. And I think we do all understand now that you can campaign for something and it isn't shallow or whatever the words are to be interested in other parts of life. I think that's just the way it is now.
So what is the campaign you're most proud of?
I think, I was so lucky to work with really great teams on newspaper, on magazines. So I think the campaigns where we saw laws being changed, I worked on the campaign at the Daily Mirror where we were trying to change the law around women who had murdered their husbands after years and years of abuse. And I interviewed Sarah Thornton, who was the first woman to go to prison for murdering her husband after it was just such a brutal story. She had gone through such and that was what we did at the Mirror contributed to the change in the law around coercive control, which was so needed at the time all those years ago. I was really proud of the He for She campaign, which we did with UN women when I was at Elle, where we created a video which won an awards actually, where we pictures of women in places of power all around the world, and we took the men out, and you would see one woman stood at the end of a massive auditorium, and it really brought home in 30 seconds what was the point of all these decision-making places happening if there were no women there making a decision. You were making decisions for all the population, and 50% of the population weren't represented. So I was really pleased with that. We did that in the magazine over a year-long period, and it culminated in a cover with Emma Watson, who'd become a spokesperson for UN Women, and I went out to New York, and she delivered the speech, and it all landed with our feminist issue on December. So I was really proud of that, because it's giving information to women constantly, a very targeted audience, and that was the audience I'm interested in, and the audience I wanted to do my journalism around.
So you talk about community, and that's something you can get from social media. Obviously, social media is a double-edged sword. Do you think it can ever do the job of a particular brand? So instead of having a magazine or a newspaper or a television show or whatever, radio show, website, can social media do that work?
I think there are different platforms where you can create voices that can do that work. Yes, I don't really know where those amazing, groundbreaking fashion shoots can live beyond print. That's where I like to see it. For me, but that might be because of the age I am and my background and history. I want to see a massive 20-page shoot in a magazine. That's what I want to see. I want to see those clothes. I want to see that story. I think that's beautiful. So I'm not sure yet where that is, although I think video is part of that. I've seen those clothes come to life is amazing as well. And, with an amazing art director, some kind of very creative storytelling, that's art for me. So I like to see that. But I do think some of the work that's done with magazines and newspapers can be done more quickly, more effectively, perhaps on social media platforms, because it does activate a community, the message is spread, and you can, in real time, you can respond to things. So I think it's a very exciting time to be a young journalist, actually, because there's many places and many ways of getting messages across. I mean, I think when you see it in places of the world where there is conflict, it's the community on the ground that are changing the news story, that are updating the world and what's going on around them. So that's a very different way of behaving. And I think, when you listen to documentary filmmakers, particularly those making stuff in Afghanistan and places like that now, they are taking stuff from the community, but their job now is twice as hard because they've got a double fact check source in a very different way from the way we used to before. So I think it's all evolving, but a lot of that content is amazing that's coming through those platforms.
So you started out in local papers, as you said earlier. You left Cornwall and worked on a paper in South London where one of your colleagues was Piers Morgan. Yes. So what have your other peers from that time gone on to do? How many of them are still working in journalism, or, obviously Piers is still doing something, isn't he?
Well, we have, there's 4 of us that are very close from the Wimbledon. I worked on the Wimbledon News. We had an extraordinary news editor called Mac Eiffel. He was from Guyana, and he was tough, really tough on us. But we see each other once or twice a year, and we have a reunion, Wimbledon News reunion. We learnt on the ground really quickly that you can't get anything wrong. You just simply can't, and that you've got to give all to a story, and that you're on call 24 hours a day. That's what it is being a news journalist. And it was a brilliant baptism of fire, slightly, for me, coming from a local Cornish paper where I think a big story was how many things you could get in a in a matchbox at the fair. So I was suddenly in South London covering really big stories and learning a lot. But I think, we have stayed in the fields of journalism. Robin writes books now, or we know what Piers is doing. And Belinda is, I think she works for a charity now, so she does a lot of different things. But we've stayed quite close. I think most newspaper journalists who started in those days on local papers are pretty close to each other and do stay in touch and have stayed in the environment. They've gone on to do great things. It was really the only place because that's where the training schemes were.
Yeah. So we talk about your career being divided into three phases, sort of newspapers, magazines, digital, and now your new life. Which phase has been your favorite?
I haven't really found anything a favorite. I think my favorite times have been with the teams that I've really loved working with. So the Times Saturday magazine, which Jill Morgan launched, and I came from Marie Claire to be her deputy. That was one of the happiest times on a launch. It was just so brilliant. It was groundbreaking. It was new. It was the first glossy on a Saturday, and that I loved. And most of the people I work with down now are among my closest friends, my very closest friends. And the team I had at Elle, I think, was probably the best team I've ever worked with, and they were extraordinary women. They're one or two men, and I'm incredibly close to them as well. But then I think it's, for me, I measure it by teams. I love working with Trish Halpin, who she used to edit Marie Claire, Red, and InStyle. So between us, we present postcards from midlife. It's actually had 4.5 million downloads. Not one.
Sorry.
And between us, we've known each other for 25 years in the magazine industry, and this is just such an adventure. So at the moment, this feels like the favorite because we're just having a ball. It's just such an adventure. We knew we had to evolve what we were doing. We knew we had to take our content and our community with us, because those readers, we've edited the big magazines, those readers have come with us. They know who we are. We're quite important in some of their lives. They've been pivotal in some of their lives with the information we've given them. And they've come to podcasting because that's a really great way, actually, particularly for women, I think, of listening to content. So everything's been a favourite in a way. I haven't really ever had a job that I didn't like. I mean, I worked at The Sun for Kelvin Mackenzie, and I found that a little brutal. I can't say that was my most enjoyable, but I had some great people there who were very helpful, and I learnt a lot in the time I was there.
So are there challenges, do you think, of a woman hitting midlife and older in media and journalism? Because so much has changed since women came into the industry. Are we respected enough for our knowledge?
I think women feel invisible when they hit midlife because culturally we are invisible. We're not so much now, but we aren't in films, we're not in books, we're not on TV, we're not on radio in the volume that men are. There was a survey, Channel 4 did a survey in 2016 of the number of men versus the number of women on television in any area, entertainment, news. It was 2 to 1. So therefore, we're invisible as women, and then as we get older, where youth is valued more, we become even more invisible in places culturally. So I do think it's a bit of a challenge, but I see it as a positive challenge and one to take up, because now there are so many great role models of women. Most of the morning presenters are women in midlife. A lot of the documentary makers are women in midlife. A lot of the that Bridget Christie thing that's just been on TV, The Change. That's a sitcom that got red light. It takes so long to get green light for a sitcom, any kind of sitcom. So imagine what she went through, and it did get the green light, and it was amazing. So I think things are changing. I think they are a challenge, but as long as we're all a voice around each other and we're sharing our knowledge, and as long as we're not always thinking there's only room for one woman in this room and it has to be me, as long as we're thinking how can we get more women in this room rather than I'm the only woman that can be in this room, then I think that's important. But I think this generation behind me are thinking that, and I think we are all internally looking out for women and what we can do to make it better, to have more of a diverse representation on screen and in newspapers. It's about also, I think the challenges are noticing stuff and really looking up, noticing those headlines as they go through on proofs as a woman, noticing where there's kind of quite subconscious bias and sexism and racism, just noticing that. And I think we are beginning to do that more. And I think that's a good thing.
Do you think there's a responsibility on us, maybe as older journalists, not necessarily just women, to keep reinventing ourselves and upskilling ourselves, or do you think there's even more pressure on women to do so?
I think that's the fun part, but I'm unusual in that. I just think it's not really to do with age, is it? It's to do with trying new things and being prepared to try new things and moving with the times and being as plugged in to what's happening in terms of culture and media as you possibly can be. The whole point of being a journalist is to be able to spot patterns, look at timelines, see trends, get to the story first. And you're not going to do that if you're stuck in the same roles. You've got to start moving around. You've got to adapt to change. And I think that's a really good mantra for life in any career. Well, what's coming up and where can I fit into that? And to, largely try and sort of have a thicker skin around ignoring what people might be saying about your age.
What's the toughest new thing you've had to learn? I saw you battling with reels at one point, but I think you've cracked that.
Well, it's the tech. It's the toughest. I'm quite a visual. I mean, this is just one long chat about myself. It feels very self-indulgent. I'm quite visual and I like making things. So I like to feel things and be practically around things. And when we would do our shoots with fashion, we would pull it together with paper and, it would be quite artistic. And, anything to do with a mobile phone is not like that. That is, and you've really got to get your head around how every single thing works. You've got to be on every app. You've got to do all of that if you want to be a success. I mean, or you want to do it that way. You don't have to do it that way. But I think the tech has been the issue for me. Just the volume of Zoom, Teams. We now work, Trish and I, from home or from the studio, and it's just every day there's a new thing we've got to download and join, which is a bit frustrating when it's just not your area of interest.
So, I mean, something you mentioned earlier about health campaigns and menopause, which is something you've written very honestly about the effect it had on you. From not being seen anywhere, it now seems to be everywhere with lots of loud voices. Have we reached saturation point, or do we still need to keep pushing? Because, as you say, only 1 in 2 presenters or high-profile journalists are women. And it will affect women at some point in their lives.
Well, every woman, yeah. I mean, everyone will have some form of it's just, for me, it was just about when we started 4 years ago, and, we were the first voice in this space, I have to say. It was just about shock at what we were going through, and then our instinct as journalists to share the information and to find out what was going on. It always morphs. These new things, which are new headlines, always morph into something. You've got to remember the readership of all these newspapers was getting older, so everyone was interested in it. It wasn't just a sudden thing. We like to think everyone's reading newspapers. It's not. It's mostly people over 45. So everyone was coming with us on it. It was something that a lot of people were experiencing. So we were just reporting on it, really, in a way. But I think when you have something like this that dominates the headlines, when TV becomes interested and everyone's looking at, audience figures and new things to drive audience figures, then of course you will have people writing the complete opposite and saying this is just a trend, this is just a natural thing women go through, we shouldn't be talking about it, blah, blah, blah. Well, that is just the news cycle, isn't it? One thing happens here, someone denies it here. It's just that's the yin and yang of news, and, denying HRT headlines is probably drives traffic, so people are probably quite pleased when that appears in a newspaper because it's probably good for their circulation. So it's really not people looking at the emotional side of it from news. But I think it was our duty as women's magazines editors to deliver the information of what we were going through to a community roughly the same age as us. There was no way around that. We had to put it there. Davina McCall's documentary reached millions. Very good, probably saved lives. If it saved one life, it's worth doing it, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of how I view it. But I don't think we've reached peak menopause. And, there's always things to discover about our health and aging. And it's a very positive, magnificent time of life. It's a really, putting all that information that you've got and all that experience into a place is a brilliant thing to be able to do. And, I've been more liberated in this time of life than I have. I've been happier, calmer, ready to do new things than before, which is a great thing. So why not share that?
Now, I know this is a question that would probably never get asked of a man, but how have you balanced being a mum of 4 with your career? Because it is the reality that for a lot of the people with us on this webinar, they are the ones taking the brunt of juggling the childcare, working out how they balance their career with bringing up kids. And it's tough. Whatever the rights and wrongs are, that it should be a shared responsibility. How did you cope?
It's not.
Any words of advice?
Well, from an advice point of view, I always think make sure you discuss with your partner before you have children, probably in that 6 months leading up to having children, exactly who's going to do what, because I don't think our generation did. And if you do, even to the extent of writing it down, everyone is relieved of what's going on. Everyone knows where they stand. Everybody knows the amount of work that is going to be involved in blending your work with your family, you know, and whether you're a mum who works out of the home or a mum who works in the home. I hate that phrase, stay at home mum, because it sounds like you make a choice not to do something hard. It's not often that way for women. It's just as hard to be a mother who works entirely at home than a mother who works for someone else outside of the home, I think. You have to be really well planned, really well organized. You have to have the childcare if you can afford it, and you have to set really strong boundaries at work. With one of my maternity leaves, I think it was the third one, I had asked to do a 9-day fortnight, and they had suggested that I do it unofficially, that it would be fine. And I said it was really important to do it officially, because if I can do it, then other women can see me doing it, and they will realize that it is possible to do these things, that there is some kind of flexibility in the way we work. And there should always be some kind of flexibility, as long as the business gets what the business needs delivered. That has to be really important. We've come, you know, a really long way from my first maternity leave at 33 to my last maternity leave at 43. It just was so much better. I was in such a better place. I was a better mother and I was a better employee, because I was given more of what I needed to make the whole process work. At no point in his career did my husband have to have any of those negotiations. So it's a real shame, you know, it's just not fair. And it continues to be not fair. You know, not allowing people to work from home makes life really difficult for women. It doesn't make it as difficult for men. We absolutely know that from all the surveys after the pandemic, and that's not fair. So you have to try and work out, we all have to collectively be vocal about what we need and how we want it to work, I think. And that's, you know, you're going to drop the ball all over the place. That's just the way it is, and it doesn't make you a bad parent. It just makes you a parent, because you would drop the ball whether you're at work or not at work. I think realizing that, lowering the standards around this kind of deification of motherhood, as well as if it's the most important thing in the world. It's not. It's one of the most important things you'll do. It's not the most important thing you will do. So, you know, relieving yourself of that pressure as well, I think, is really important. And just sort of every day taking a moment to check in with, what do I need today to be a good mum and to be a good employee and to be healthy and happy and get the sleep I need? What do I need every day? I think millennials are doing that. I certainly felt that more with my millennial team at Style. With the, you know, we have a group of agents who work with us who are young millennial women on the podcast, and they have a very different attitude, which I think is really good. It's much more about protecting their mental health and working within a less manic way than you and I worked, Louise, in our time.
I think that's probably true. A little less mania. So you, in recent years, have made yourself the story, which I think for a lot of journalists is quite hard, isn't it? And there is a lot of trend in commissioning of people commissioners wanting the journalist to put themselves at the center of the story. Have you found that hard, or have you welcomed it?
Well, I'm uncomfortable with it, but I like writing about. I mean, I loved writing about parenting. I think I shared too much when they were little. I look back and I realized that, you know, they didn't give me permission to share then, and that was wrong. But we all learn from our mistakes. I don't think you will have seen any of my kids in anything the last 5-6 years, even though I've written about parenting almost solidly. And I enjoy writing about parenting, and I enjoy it when I get messages from women saying, I could have gone down a terrible route, I didn't because of something you wrote. So I like that. I was so absolutely furious about the medical profession's gaslighting of women around menopause and perimenopause. I couldn't keep it in. I just couldn't keep it in. So I had to write about that. And I couldn't write about it in a newsy way. I had to share the awful gaslighting I'd gone through. And, you know, and I've heard stories of women who've been on the verge of taking their lives because of what they went through. And when you know what you've done has changed the way a woman's approached everything, it's worth it putting it out there. I'm not comfortable with it, but I think there is a sense, particularly because social media exists to tell other people's stories, because we can control our own stories now via social media. There is a sense that people want to read about other people. And I think also after the pandemic, we just wanted some humanity in our journalism. We wanted to read about kindness. We wanted to read about caring. We wanted to read about people to help us all feel collectively better about what we were going through. There's a sense, I think now, of people not wanting to feel alone. And that's what's coming through in the journalism. I don't think it's showing off. I don't think it's this boomer type of idea that, they're just talking about themselves. They're just all they're doing. I think it's very different. And I think it's a collective thing that society is expecting now. And I think it's a really, really good thing.
I mean, you and Trish both share a lot about yourselves on the podcast, but what skills as a journalist are essential to make it a success with 4.5 million downloads?
Well, it's funny because when we had our first review of the podcast in the Times, the reviewer said, I wish they just talk more about themselves. It sounds very scripted and as if they're just giving you facts all the time. So because we were uncomfortable about talking about ourselves, but the key to a good podcast is talking. I mean, all the good ones are talking about themselves. And even if you listen to Alistair Campbell and Rory Thiggy in their number one podcast, there's a real personal element there as well, and it's about what they think. So it's become easier to talk about ourselves. I think the skills you need as a podcaster, to be clear about what you're offering, clear about who your audience is, and to make it unique as well as accessible. So we like to make it exclusive. We've had everyone from Elizabeth Hurley to Claudia Winkleman on the show in terms of celebrities. But we've also had the mayor, Sadiq Khan, on the show. We've had Caroline Harris, the MP, on the show. We've had Mike Gale, the writer. We've had Richard Curtis, the filmmaker. So it's a bit of a surprise every week. So we're offering something you can't get anywhere else. And we're offering it to the community in the language they want to hear it in. But we also offer quite a bit of waffle. And they like the waffle. That's what, it's when you're pottering about or on your jog or on your walk, what's our audience doing? What do they want to listen to while they're doing that? That was a big learning for us. We aren't Fee and Jane from Times Radio, or fortunately, they are news-based and it's weekly and it's based on the news that's happened. We are something very different from them. So our point of difference, and we're different from Midpoint and we're different from The Shift. So we have very clear about our point of difference and what our community is doing while they're listening. And we're constantly researching. We set up a private Facebook group so we could get feedback, and we get a lot of feedback, and we've changed our content based on the feedback. Our podcast is really interactive with its community, which I think a lot of podcasts are, and a lot of personalities with podcasts do it that way. So you've got to learn that skill. You've got to get a really good producer who can say to you, that's too much waffle, or that's too many facts, or that interview's too long, and does a really great edit. And you've got to get a good team if you're at that stage where you're working commercially with brands to represent you and work with you. And we very specifically picked a team of really bright, vibrant young women who had a great view of that. So you've got to work with the people that make it good as well.
So we've got a question from the audience saying, what are you and Trish finding are the freedoms and restrictions of the podcast format that you couldn't do in magazines?
Well, the freedom is we're totally in charge of it, and we don't have to pass it through any kind of money men above us. So if you work in the era we worked in glossy magazines, it was women all the way to the top 4 jobs. Something had to go through a man, and a man had an opinion on what J-Lo should be wearing on the cover of Cosmo. The man didn't know, but the man had an opinion, and we had to go through that. So we don't have to do any of that malarkey anymore. It just goes through us and our agents and our producer. The restrictions are the timing. We have to do, because of the schedule, we have to do it 2 or 3 weeks in advance. That's a little bit of a restriction, but we've been very clear about the way we want to work at this stage of our lives. We're fortunate enough to be financially stable, so we have been clear that we do not want to work every day, that we have teenagers. They are very time consuming. We want to have, this is so grateful to have time to be with my teenagers, which I wouldn't have had working on a weekly newspaper. It would have killed me. I wouldn't have had time to be with them. And I'm really grateful that this change of career has given us that. So we're very specific about, if we will turn something down if it's going to cause us extreme stress, no matter how good it is, because we just don't want that in our lives anymore. So that's been, that was one of the mantras we wrote when we started the business together. What would be deal breakers for us? If it becomes too stressful, then we will not want to do it. And we were both clear about that. So I think when you work with a partner as well, you've got to work the way they work, and they work a bit the way you work. So it's a molding of things. You've got to be absolutely sure you both have the best interest of the business, and you've got to be able to pick up when someone can't do something for any reason, and know that they will pick up when you can't do it.
There are so many podcasts out there, and it's sort of the number one growing platform for people to get news from and information from. Are there any podcasts that have not been done yet? I mean,
I don't know. I mean, they're very hard work podcasts because
people think it's easy, don't they? You get
it's
all
not
these
easy at
celebs
all.
who
So
just sit and
we have
talk to somebody.
Yeah, it's 3 parts, our podcast. It's the intro, the chat, the interview, and then we do How to Win, which is a fact-based, tried and tested, specific thing. We might go on a trip to do it. So time you've researched the interview, you've sorted out the How to Win, you've written the intro, so it's funny and it feels to the audience, it doesn't upset anyone, and it's right for who you are. Plus you've then looked at all the advertising, you've done all the ad reads. It's a lot of work goes into a podcast. There's 2 of us doing it as well. I mean, it's really hard if it's just one of you. So it is hard work, but I think I think there is a figure, you have to be in the top sort of 3%, or the rest underneath are probably struggling to get the downloads that are needed. And it is still a little bit Wild West, and we're all still learning. Politics does really well. There's a lot more men than women presenting to people shows, which I think that will change gradually. It's a hard, you've got to really slog at it. You've got to really put the effort in. You've got to check all your facts. You've got to make sure you don't libel anyone. That's all down to you, I think, as a podcaster. But I think there will be new shows because there will be new things people want to discuss. I mean, society is evolving, constantly evolving, and sometimes who knew true crime was going to be massive? Those are the massive podcasts, aren't they? But then sort of we did know, because we're always fascinated by who did it, who done it's been the thing forever, hasn't it? It's all just storytelling. All journalism is storytelling with the right facts.
That does help. Does tech mean there are more potential trends flying around than ever before? We've got Threads coming out now, haven't we? And how do you identify which will actually hit the mainstream? So are you going to be on Threads?
We're going to be on TikTok. We feel that there's a really big younger audience looking for older women. We've done to give them advice, done a lot of research around that. So we might be launching something on TikTok that will be separate of the podcast. I'm not sure how Threads will go. I certainly sense that, other new things might be coming out. It's about sort of you've got to be on social media quite a lot to work out what everyone's talking about. And you've got to go out and about into other communities, into other industries, as it were, to find out what they're talking about as well. We can't just stay in the midlife zone. That's not what our business is about. Our business is storytelling to women. So where else are they telling their stories? Where else are those communities gathering? What do they need from women with our experience? So it's just being mindful all the time, joining the dots and looking at what's going on. I read a lot of the kind of tech publications, Wired and things like that. I follow everyone on Facebook. I just want to see what's happening. It's very time consuming though, so we will only go on to something at this stage of life if we have time to do it, and it's easy to do.
How much time do you spend on social media, personally and professionally?
Well, I've got a very carefully curated feed that makes me laugh and gives me joy. So if something becomes negative and upsetting, I just stop following it. Or I stop engaging with it. So I probably spend quite a lot of my day on social media, at least 2 hours, because I'm selling my brand, I'm giving information out, I'm interacting with my community. And I feel like I've been quite good at curating it so I don't get involved in anything that upsets me or causes problems. I might correct facts or stop arguments if I feel that they're wrong and they're unpleasant and there's bullying, but I try to make sure also that my daughters curate their feed They understand that they can look at what they want to look at, and whatever the algorithm is giving them, they can stop that, and they can just stop following that, and they can turn it off, they can turn notifications off, all that kind of thing. I think social media is a new way of communicating, and journalism is communication.
So is there anything about your career that when you look back, or you look at other women's amazing careers, that you would do differently, or you wish you'd done something like she has?
I think it's more that I look back at some of the content perhaps, and I'm slightly not, I mean, I slightly regret playing into body, all the worries about around women's bodies, which I think we did play into with magazines, and I feel shocked that I did that, and I didn't think it through more, that I wasn't more proactive around it. I didn't think deeply as I should have done perhaps, and I would hate to have caused any woman any harm in any way doing that. That I didn't question a lot of what, that's the only thing perhaps that I regret. I mean, I look at all those amazing war reporters, and I look at Christina Lamb on the Sunday Times and just think that woman's had the most amazing career, and she's the best foreign correspondent in the world, and she's just the most lovely person. So I look at that as well, and I saw her, since her life has been so extraordinarily different from mine. I didn't want to do it. I wouldn't have been anywhere near as good at it as her, but it's great to see those women, you know, in I look at the women doing TV news in the morning and doing all those morning shows. That's just an extraordinary commitment. Louise Minchin, Susanna Reid, Kate Garraway, Holly Willoughby. There's an extraordinary commitment to your career, getting up at the times they get up and doing it. So I think I mean, I try not to regret anything because you can't change it. So you might as well just look positively forward.
And have you got any advice for women who are trying to navigate a portfolio career and establishing a brand and a business all at the same time? So you're promoting yourself, but you still want to have the credibility of a proper journalist. I hate to use that phrase, but
yeah,
it's something we've been asked before.
Yeah, I think that's changing a bit. I would always say you have to get your facts absolutely right. I know I keep saying this, but I notice a lot now with people who are doing lots of things that they plug into arguments where they don't really know the facts of it. So they're just saying something without having an absolute sense of what factually is going on. So I think you need to know your subject before you get engaged in it, and you have to be really clear on what did happen, what didn't happen, etc. And I think there's always this sense of fear. I certainly notice it with young women, of what everyone else is doing, and I think you have to stop that. You just be true to what you are doing and what you're offering. And you know, the value of great journalism in the Sun is the same as the value of great journalism in the Times. It's the same as the value of great journalism in Cosmopolitan or on online platforms. So I think that you just need to be sensible about just delivering good quality, factually accurate, brilliant content that fits to what you think your brand is, and not worry about what other people are doing all the time, because that's, you know, what people think of you as well is something you can't change unless you've done something absolutely terrible and, you know, murdered half their family. What they think of you is their problem, not your problem. And I do notice a lot of young women that I've worked with in journalism really crippled by this, what will other people think? And you've just got to get rid of that, because you'll get to 50 and you won't give a toss what anyone else thinks. So you're going to get there anyway. You might as well start earlier on that. Stop worrying about what other people are doing and thinking about you, as long as you are proud of your content. But do take advice from, younger and older and your contemporaries as well, but still do what you need to do.
So you say you've worked with some amazing journalists and some really supportive journalists. Is there one single piece of advice that you've been given in your career that you would pass on, this gem?
I think,
apart from get your facts right.
Get your facts right. I think when I worked with Helen Gurley-Brown, who launched Cosmo, and whatever you think about some of the stories in Cosmo, it changed women's lives. Well, you know, Louise, globally. It campaigned for abortion rights, it campaigned for financial independence, it made women believe they were seen and they could do more than society was telling they could do at the time. So Helen was, you know, she came from such a poor background and had made her way into the corridors of power. It was just extraordinary. She said to me once, you just have to ask. So in those days, we would write a letter. She would say, anyone will respond to you. So don't not ask. And I think that's the kind of, you can sit at home as a journalist and think, well, that's be a really good idea, but so-and-so won't do that if we ask, such and such won't do that. They won't do that shoot, or they won't do that piece. They won't speak to me if I go. Well, they won't if you don't ask. So it was just sort of get over yourself, stop worrying what anyone might think about it, and just ask. And I think that's how will you know unless you ask is probably the key bit of advice. You will get so many more stories, so much better content if you ask.
That's brilliant. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
For
I've been
joining us
helpful
and sharing your insight and yeah, the many different things you've done. I think it's been really helpful, and I think it's great as well to look forward to the future of journalism, which on that point we have coming up at Women in Journalism. Our next panel webinar is AI and what does it mean for journalism and your career. So you got any views on AI, Lorraine?
It's just so big. It's just so big. I can't quite wrap my head around it. I need to sit with it for a bit and talk to some experts and step away from the fear mongering and also the other bits of it that, you know, there's so many conflicting stories around what it will mean at the moment. I need to work that out before I can make a comment on AI.
Well, or you could join us.
I could join you.
25th of July online. There's a link in the chat. And we've got a panel of amazing experts where we're going to look at what it means for truth, what it means for journalism, what it means for jobs. Are there ways we can use it to help us in our work? Or are there areas that we need to be wary of? So thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And enjoy the sunshine. It's sunny in Suffolk. I don't know if it's sunny where you are, but hopefully it is.
Sunny in North London, yes.
Hurrah! Thank you. Bye.